You think you belong here, Detroit girl? Preston Huntington III sneered contemptuously, his manicured hands still clutching the hem of the fragile freshman's skirt, holding her in the school hallway. This is Westman Academy, not a street corner in Detroit. Zara Johnson slowly raised her head, and something in her dark eyes made Preston's golden boys unconsciously take a step back. A cold gleam that was not like fear. I'm not the type to repeat myself twice, handsome. Her voice was surprisingly calm. You don't know who you're messing with. I'll break your arm in 10, 9, 8. I know exactly who you are. A new toilet brush, he said mockingly, unaware that in 24 hours he would be apologizing to her and begging for mercy. And the whole academy would be discussing how the Detroit girl took revenge on the golden boy. You are watching Chronicles, an original story by the author of this channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss this incredible story. Let me tell you something about walking into hell with a smile on your face. That is exactly what I did on my first day at Westmont Academy. My name is Zara Johnson, and I am about to share with you the most transformative story of my life, one that will make you question everything you think you know about justice, privilege, and what it really means to fight back. Picture this, a 17-year-old black girl from Detroit, clutching a worn backpack that had seen better days, stepping through iron gates that probably cost more than my mama's car. The morning mist hung around those perfectly manicured lawns like some kind of fairy tale. Except this was no Disney movie, honey. This was Connecticut elite territory, where the grass was greener because it was watered with old money and maintained by people who looked just like me, but who went home to very different neighborhoods when their shifts ended. I had earned every single penny of that full athletic scholarship through blood, sweat, and 3 years of getting my face rearranged in Coach Williams' gym back in Detroit. Boxing was not just my sport, it was my salvation, my ticket out of a neighborhood where dreams went to die, and hope was as rare as a unicorn sighting. But standing there in front of Westman Academy, watching Bentleys and Maseratis pull up like it was some kind of luxury car show, I felt smaller than I had in years. The irony was not lost on me. Here I was, a state champion boxer, scared of a bunch of teenagers in pressed uniforms. But fear has a funny way of creeping up on you when you realize you are not just entering a new school. You are entering a whole different world where the rules are written in invisible ink and the game is rigged before you even sit down at the table. My mama had pulled me aside the night before, her hands trembling slightly as she held mine. Baby girl, she had said, her voice carrying the weight of every struggle we had ever faced together. These rich folks do not need to know about your fighting. Just focus on your studies and stay out of trouble. The desperation in her voice was palpable. This scholarship was not just my opportunity, it was our family's lifeline. One wrong move, one complaint from the wrong parent, and everything we had worked for could disappear faster than snow in July. So I promised her I would keep my mouth shut, keep my head down, and blend in like wallpaper. Looking back now, that might have been the most naive promise I ever made in my 17 years of life. The hallways of Westman Academy were like something out of a museum. Marble floors so polished you could see your reflection, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, and oil paintings of dead white men who had probably never worked a day in their lives, but whose great-great-grandchildren were now my classmates. Everything screamed money, power, and a level of privilege that was so far removed from my reality that I felt like an alien visiting from another planet. The other students moved through these halls with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never being told no, never being questioned, never having to prove they belong somewhere. Their uniforms were perfectly tailored, their shoes were spotless, and their conversations revolved around spring break trips to Europe and summer houses in the Hamptons. Meanwhile, I was trying to figure out how to make my target clearance uniform look like it belonged in the same zip code as their custom-made everything. But it was not just the material differences that hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. It was the way they looked at me, or rather, the way they looked through me. To them, I was not a person with hopes, dreams, and a work ethic that could move mountains. I was a charity case, a diversity statistic, a living, breathing reminder that their perfect little bubble occasionally had to make room for people like me to keep up appearances. Chapter 2. The Golden Boys and Their Poisonous Kingdom. Let me paint you a picture of Preston Huntington III that will make you understand exactly what kind of entitled monster we were dealing with. This boy was not just rich, he was generational wealth rich. The kind of money that buys politicians, builds wings of hospitals, and ensures that your family name is carved into marble for eternity. At 6'3", with perfectly styled blonde hair, crystal blue eyes, and a jaw that looked like it was chiseled by Renaissance sculptors, Preston was everything that American privilege looked like when it wore a human face. But here's the thing about pretty packages. Sometimes they contain the ugliest contents you can imagine. Preston moved through the halls of Westman Academy like he was surveying his personal kingdom, and in many ways, he was. His father was not just on the board of trustees, he practically owned the place. The Huntington family had been writing checks to this school since before my great-grandmother was born, and their influence was woven into every brick, every policy, and every unspoken rule that kept people like me in our place. His crew was equally revolting, each one a perfect specimen of what happens when you give unlimited resources to young men who have never faced a single consequence for their actions. Chad Blackwell, whose pharmaceutical family had made billions selling overpriced medications to desperate people, was Preston's right-hand man. This boy had the kind of dead eyes that told you he had never felt genuine empathy for another human being in his entire 18 years of existence. Then there was Bryce Morrison, son of a senator who specialized in voting against civil rights while smiling for the cameras. Bryce had perfected the art of looking innocent while participating in the most vicious acts of cruelty you could imagine. Together they formed what I started calling the Golden Boys, a pack of predators who had turned psychological and social manipulation into an art form. They did not just bully, they systematically destroyed anyone who did not fit their narrow definition of what belonged at Westman Academy. And the most insidious part was how they did it with such calculated precision that it rarely looked like bullying to the adults who could have stopped them. Their methods were sophisticated and cruel. They would isolate scholarship students by spreading rumors about their personal hygiene or family situations. They would accidentally bump into international students in the hallways, causing them to drop their books while making comments about knowing their place. They would organize study groups and social events that just happened to exclude anyone who did not meet their standards of acceptability. And when confronted by teachers or administrators, they would put on their most innocent faces and claim it was all just misunderstandings or coincidences. But the most disgusting part was how the system protected them. Teachers who witnessed their behavior would look the other way because challenging the Huntington family or their allies was career suicide. Administrators who received complaints would file them away in drawers that never saw the light of day, and parents who tried to speak up for their children would find themselves facing legal threats from lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. Chapter 3. The Day Evil Showed Its True Face. Thursday, October 15th. That is a date that will be burned into my memory until the day I die, because that was the day I witnessed something so vile, so utterly depraved, that it shattered every excuse I had been making for my own cowardice. I was walking toward the library for my mandatory tutoring session, thinking about the calculus homework that was giving me more trouble than it should have, when I heard sounds coming from the girls' bathroom that made my blood run cold. There were voices, angry, cruel voices, mixed with sounds of struggle and what could only be described as pure terror. My first instinct was to keep walking, to mind my own business, to stick to the plan of staying invisible and safe. But then I heard a voice that I recognized, a voice that belonged to Marcus Thompson, and that voice was begging for mercy in a way that no 14-year-old should ever have to beg. I pushed open that bathroom door, and what I saw inside was like something out of a nightmare that racist monsters have when they dream about the good old days. Preston Huntington III and two of his Golden Boy cronies had Marcus bent over one of the toilets, taking turns shoving his head down into the water while laughing like hyenas who had just found fresh meat. The sound of Marcus gasping for air, choking on toilet water, and pleading for them to stop was something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. "Please," Marcus was sobbing between dunks, his voice raw with terror and humiliation. "I did not do anything wrong. I just want to go to class." Nothing wrong? Preston laughed, and the sound was like broken glass scraping against my eardrums. Boy, your mistake was thinking you belong here in the first place. This is not some inner city school where trash like you can pretend to be equal to your betters. The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact tone in his voice, told me everything I needed to know about how these boys saw people like Marcus and me. We were not human beings to them. We were problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, reminders of a changing world that they desperately wanted to return to the way it used to be. Just then, Ms. Rodriguez, one of the Spanish teachers, appeared in the doorway behind me. The look on her face told me that she had heard enough to understand exactly what was happening, but also that she was calculating the political cost of intervening in a situation involving the most powerful families in the school. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years dealing with entitled teenagers and their elaborate schemes. "Boys, this is the girls' restroom. You need to leave immediately." Preston's face turned red with a mixture of embarrassment and fury, but even he could not argue with a teacher's direct order. He released Marcus, who stumbled backward and nearly fell, his uniform soaked with toilet water and his dignity hanging in tatters. After the boys filed out, Ms. Rodriguez turned to me with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. "You know what you just witnessed was not right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening and reporting back to the wrong people. "Then why do not you do something about it?" I asked, my frustration boiling over like water left too long on the stove. She sighed deeply, the sound carrying the weight of countless battles she had fought and lost. Countless students she had watched suffer while her hands were tied by politics and paychecks. "Zara, honey, it is not that simple. Preston's father is not just on the board of trustees. He practically owns this place. The Huntington family has donated millions of dollars over the decades, and their influence reaches into every corner of this institution." "So money trumps basic human decency?" I shot back. "So as long as somebody's daddy writes big enough checks, their kids can torture other students with impunity." "The system protects the money," she corrected with brutal honesty. "But sometimes students have to find their own ways to create change." Chapter 4. When the predator becomes the prey. The next day, I was walking to my locker after third period when I felt someone grab the back of my skirt and yank me backwards so hard that I nearly lost my balance. I spun around ready to unleash 3 years of pent-up rage on whoever had put their hands on me, and found myself face to face with Preston Huntington III and his pack of golden jackals. The hallway around us had suddenly become very empty, as other students developed an urgent need to be somewhere else when trouble started brewing. "You think you can embarrass me in front of a teacher and just walk away?" Preston snarled, his perfectly manicured fingers still gripping my skirt like I was his personal property. "You think you can stick your nose into business that does not concern you without facing consequences?" The look in his eyes was pure hatred, mixed with the kind of entitlement that comes from never being told no, never facing real consequences, never meeting someone who refused to be intimidated by his family's money and influence. But there was something else there too, a desperate need to reassert his dominance, to prove to his followers and himself that he was still the apex predator in this particular ecosystem. "This is Westman Academy, not some Detroit street corner where trash like you makes the rules," he continued, his voice loud enough to carry to anyone who might be listening. "Here, people like you learn to show proper respect to your betters, or they learn what happens when they forget their place." I slowly raised my head and looked directly into his eyes, letting him see something that made his Golden Boy crew take an unconscious step backward. It was not fear. It was the cold, calculating gaze of someone who had grown up in neighborhoods where survival meant knowing how to handle predators. Someone who had spent years training for exactly this kind of moment. "I am not the type to repeat myself twice, handsome," I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the volcanic rage building in my chest. "You do not know who you are messing with. I will break your arm in 10, 9, 8. The countdown was something Coach Williams had taught me, a way to give an opponent one last chance to back down before the situation escalated beyond the point of no return. It was a courtesy that predators rarely deserved, but that separated civilized people from animals. Preston laughed, the sound harsh and grating like fingernails on a chalkboard. I know exactly who you are, a new toilet brush, and I think it is time you learned what happens to scholarship girls who stick their noses where they do not belong. He started pulling me toward the nearest bathroom, his intention crystal clear. He was going to do to me exactly what he had done to Marcus, except this time, there would be no teacher to interrupt, no witnesses to testify, no consequences for his actions. In his mind, I was about to learn the same lesson that every other person of color at Westman Academy had learned, that money and privilege could crush dignity and justice without breaking a sweat. That was when the last thread of my self-control finally snapped. In one fluid motion, I grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back in a perfect arm lock. Preston's cocky expression turned to shock as a pain shot up his arm. "Let me go," he gasped. "Not until you learn some manners," I said calmly, applying just enough pressure to make my point without causing real damage. Chad and Bryce stepped forward, but I fixed them with a stare that stopped them cold. "You want to help your boy?" I asked. "Then here's what's going to happen. If you want to prove you're such a tough guy against girls, Preston, then do it right. Boxing ring. After school tomorrow. Just you and me." "You're challenging me to a fight?" Preston couldn't believe what he was hearing. I released his arm and stepped back. "I'm giving you a chance to prove you're half the man you think you are. Unless you prefer picking on kids in bathroom stalls." Preston rubbed his wrist, his face red with humiliation and rage. Students had gathered around us, phones out, recording everything. "Fine," he said finally. "Tomorrow after school, but when I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd kept your mouth shut and stayed in your place." I smiled. Not a nice smile, but the kind of smile that should have warned him what he was getting into. "Preston," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of that hallway. "Listen up, pretty boy. I'm about to teach you what happens when privilege meets purpose. And honey, you ain't ready for this lesson." What happened next changed everything at Westman Academy forever. The explosion of violence and justice that followed would make Preston Huntington the third question every assumption he had ever made about power, privilege, and what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Stay tuned for the most intense part. You are not going to want to miss how the Detroit girl made the golden boy beg for mercy. Chapter 5. The night that changes everything. That night felt longer than all my 17 years combined, stretching out like some kind of cosmic joke where time decides to move at the speed of molasses when you need it most. I sat in my dorm room, and let me tell you, calling it a room was being generous since it was barely larger than a walk-in closet back home, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what the hell I had just gotten myself into. The rational part of my brain, the part that sounded suspiciously like my mama's voice, was having a complete meltdown. "Girl, what have you done?" it kept asking. "You just challenged the most powerful boy at the most powerful school in Connecticut to a public fight. Do you have any idea how many ways this can destroy your future?" But the fighter in me, the part that had been forged in Coach Williams' gym through 3 years of blood, sweat, and refusing to quit, even when everything hurt, was singing a different tune entirely. This part of me was calm, focused, and ready to show these privileged monsters what happened when they pushed someone who knew how to push back. I pulled out my phone and called Coach Williams, knowing that he would still be awake because Friday nights at the gym meant late training sessions for the fighters who had day jobs. When his familiar voice came through the speaker, gravelly from years of shouting instructions over the sound of heavy bags and jumping rope, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "Zara, baby girl," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "How is that fancy school treating you? Learning anything useful up there with all those rich folks?" "Coach," I said, cutting straight to the heart of what was eating at me, "I need to ask you something important. What do you do when fighting is not just about winning anymore, but about standing up for what is right even when everyone is telling you to sit down and shut up?" The pause that followed was long enough for me to hear the background noise of the gym, gloves hitting bags, feet shuffling on canvas, the rhythmic breathing of fighters pushing themselves to their limits. Coach Williams had heard something in my voice that told him this was not a hypothetical question. "Baby girl," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years spent training fighters and watching them face moments that would define their character. "You remember what I always told you about real strength? Real strength is not about how hard you can hit." I recited the words that had been drilled into my head since I was 14 years old. "It is about knowing when to fight and why you are fighting." That is exactly right. Now tell me what has got you thinking about this. So I told him everything. About Marcus and the toilet incident, about the systematic racism and classism that infected Westmont Academy like a disease, about Preston and his golden boys, and their reign of terror over anyone who did not fit their narrow definition of acceptable. I told him about the challenge I had issued, about the fight that was now less than 24 hours away, about the fact that I was potentially throwing away everything my family had sacrificed for. When I finished, Coach Williams was quiet for so long that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. But then he spoke, and his words hit me like a combination punch that I never saw coming. "Zara," he said, "you know what you are walking into tomorrow is not really about boxing, right? This is about everything that boy represents and everything you represent. This is about a system that has been in place for generations, and you are about to challenge it in the most public way possible." "Yes, sir," I replied, because there was no point in pretending I did not understand the stakes. "You know that win or lose, there are going to be people who try to destroy you for having the audacity to stand up. You know that money and privilege do not like being embarrassed, and they have ways of making people pay for that embarrassment." "Yes, sir." "Good. Then let me tell you something, baby girl, and I want you to listen carefully because this is the most important thing I am ever going to say to you." I held my breath, waiting for wisdom that might help me navigate the impossible situation I had created. I have been training fighters for 30 years. I have seen kids with natural talent wasted because they were afraid to take risks. I have seen mediocre fighters achieve greatness because they refused to back down when it mattered. And I have never, and I mean never, been prouder of one of my students than I am of you right now. Chapter 6. When Justice Wears Boxing Gloves. The first thing Preston did when that bell rang was exactly what I expected from someone who had learned to fight at a country club rather than a real gym. He came out swinging like he was trying to end the fight with one spectacular knockout punch that would cement his legend and restore his dominance. His opening combination was textbook rich boy boxing, big looping haymakers that looked impressive to people who did not know any better, but telegraphed themselves from 3 zip codes away. The punches carried plenty of power behind them, I will give him that. But power without precision is just wasted energy, and energy was something Preston was going to need before this was over. I slipped his first wild right hand by a margin so narrow that I felt the air displacement ruffle my hair, and the look of shock on his face when his best shot hit nothing but empty space was absolutely priceless. This boy had probably never missed a punch in his life, had probably never faced an opponent who could make him look foolish in front of an audience. "Stand still and fight like a man," he growled after missing with a particularly wild left hook that left him off balance and exposed. I did not bother responding with words because actions speak louder than trash talk, and I was about to deliver a speech that would echo through Westman Academy for years to come. Instead, I circled him like a shark who had just caught the scent of blood, letting him tire himself out while I studied his patterns, his weaknesses, his tells. Coach Williams had taught me that the first round of any fight was about gathering information, learning how your opponent moved, where they dropped their guard, what habits they had developed that could be exploited later. Preston was giving me a masterclass in everything wrong with privilege-based training, all flash and no substance, all power and no technique, all ego and no strategy. Halfway through the first round, I decided it was time to give him his first real lesson in what he was dealing with. Preston had just thrown another wild combination that left him overextended and off balance. His left hand dropped low while he admired his own punching power. That was when I stepped inside his guard and drove a short, sharp uppercut into his solar plexus with enough force to make him question every life choice that had led him to this moment. The sound that came out of Preston when that punch landed was not the grunt of a tough fighter taking a hard shot. It was the wheeze of someone who had just discovered that the real world had very different rules than the bubble he had grown up in. His perfectly styled hair suddenly did not look so perfect anymore, and his crystal blue eyes went wide with the kind of shock that comes from realizing you might not be the apex predator you thought you were. "First lesson," I said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear over the roar of the crowd. "Technique beats size every single time." The gymnasium had gone from raucous to dead silent in the space of that single punch. This was not going the way anyone had expected, least of all Preston's Golden Boy cheering section, who were starting to realize that their champion might not be quite as invincible as they had believed. Round two was where I started to really turn up the heat, where 3 years of disciplined training began to show the difference between someone who had earned their skills and someone who had purchased them. Preston was getting frustrated now, throwing wider and wilder punches as he tried to recapture the dominance that had always been his birthright. But frustration makes fighters sloppy, and sloppy fighters make mistakes, and I was ready to capitalize on every single error he gave me. I picked him apart with combinations that Coach Williams had drilled into me until they were as natural as breathing. Jab to set up distance, cross to the body to slow him down, hook to the head to remind him that I could end this whenever I wanted to. By the end of the second round, Preston's perfectly pressed uniform was soaked with sweat. There was a cut over his left eye from a particularly sharp jab, and his breathing was getting labored in a way that told me his expensive country club training had not prepared him for this level of sustained combat. "Zara, you got this!" I heard Marcus shout from the crowd, his young voice cutting through the tension like a battle cry. Other voices joined in, not many, but enough to let me know that the underdogs at Westman Academy were finally seeing someone stand up for all of us. Students who had been too scared to speak up before were finding their voices, finding their courage, finding their hope. Round three was when the real education began, when Preston finally understood that he was not just losing a fight, he was having his entire worldview demolished by someone he had written off as insignificant. As I caught him with another clean combination that snapped his head back and made his knees wobble, he did something that shocked everyone in that gymnasium. He grabbed me in a clinch, pressing his mouth close to my ear, and whispered words that revealed just how desperate he had become. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "Just let me save face. My father is watching from the balcony. If you let me win, I will leave you alone, I promise. I will apologize to Marcus. I will change everything. Just please do not embarrass me like this in front of everyone." I looked over his shoulder and saw Mr. Huntington Jr. in the VIP section, his face red with embarrassment and rage as he watched his golden boy heir apparent getting systematically dismantled by a scholarship girl from Detroit. The man looked like he was ready to storm down from the balcony and intervene personally if necessary to protect his family's reputation. For just a moment, one brief, flickering instant, I felt something that might have been sympathy for Preston. I understood what it was like to carry the weight of family expectations, to know that failure meant disappointing people whose approval you desperately needed, to feel the crushing pressure of representing something larger than yourself. But then I thought about Marcus Thompson with his head in a toilet bowl, begging for mercy that never came. I thought about every scholarship student who had been made to feel worthless, every international kid who had been told they did not belong, every person of color who had been systematically excluded from opportunities that should have been available to everyone. "Sorry, pretty boy," I whispered back, my voice carrying all the cold determination of someone who had grown up fighting for everything they had ever achieved. But some lessons cannot be taught gentle. Some changes only come through consequences. I broke the clinch, stepped back to create distance, and threw the hardest left hook of my 17 years of life. The punch caught Preston flush on the jaw, with enough force to lift him off his feet before gravity remembered its job and brought him crashing down to the canvas like a sack of expensive potatoes. The sound of his body hitting the ring was like thunder rolling across the suddenly silent gymnasium. Preston Huntington III, heir to a banking fortune, golden boy of Westmont Academy, heir apparent to generations of privilege and power, lay flat on his back staring up at the lights while the entire social order of his world crumbled around him. I stood over him, breathing hard but still strong, and looked out at a crowd that had just witnessed something that would become Westman Academy legend. The day that privilege met purpose and learned which one was stronger. Let me tell you something, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of that gymnasium despite the chaos erupting around us. This was not about boxing. This was not about proving who could hit harder or who was tougher. This was about respect, about understanding that your money, your family name, your inherited privilege, none of that gives you the right to treat other human beings like they are disposable. I looked down at Preston, who was slowly sitting up with the glazed expression of someone who had just had their reality fundamentally restructured. You want to know the difference between us? I continued. I earned everything I have. Every scholarship dollar, every victory, every moment of respect that anyone has ever shown me. You inherited everything and learned nothing from it. The silence was deafening. But here's the thing, I said, extending my hand to help him up in a gesture that shocked everyone in that gymnasium. It's never too late to start earning your place in this world instead of just taking up space in it. Preston stared at my outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity, his face cycling through emotions that probably had not visited him since he was old enough to understand what his last name meant. The entire gymnasium held its breath, waiting to see whether pride or wisdom would win out in his decision. Finally, he took my hand and let me help him to his feet. I'm sorry, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, but stripped of the arrogance that had always defined him. What I did to Marcus, what I tried to do to you, what I have been doing to students at this school for years, I was wrong. I am sorry. Chapter 7. Building Something Beautiful from the Wreckage. Monday morning at Westman Academy felt like walking through a completely different universe than the one I had inhabited just 72 hours earlier. The marble hallways looked the same, the crystal chandeliers still sparkled with obscene wealth, and the oil paintings of dead white men still stared down with their judgmental eyes. But something fundamental in the atmosphere had shifted, like the air pressure changes right before a massive storm breaks. Students who had never made eye contact with me before were nodding respectfully as I passed, some even offering genuine smiles that had nothing to do with pity or condescension. The scholarship kids were walking with their heads held higher. The international students were speaking in their native languages without glancing around nervously. And the staff members who cleaned our dormitories were getting good morning greetings instead of being treated like invisible furniture. But the most dramatic change was in Preston Huntington III himself. Gone was the swaggering prince of privilege who had ruled these halls through intimidation and inherited authority. In his place was someone who looked genuinely humbled, walking carefully through crowds of students who were still processing the fact that their former tormentor had been knocked unconscious by a scholarship girl from Detroit. I found Marcus Thompson at his locker before first period, and the transformation in this young man was almost as dramatic as what I had witnessed in Preston. His shoulders were straight instead of hunched defensively, his movements were confident instead of fearful, and when he smiled at me, it was the first genuine happiness I had seen from him since arriving at Westman. "How are you feeling?" I asked, though the answer was written all over his face. "Like I can breathe again," he replied, his voice stronger than I had ever heard it. "Like maybe I actually do belong here after all." That was when I made a decision that would change not just my remaining time at Westmont Academy, but the lives of dozens of students who had been suffering in silence while predators like Preston ruled through fear and violence. "Marcus," I said, "how would you feel about learning to fight back?" The confusion on his face was understandable. After all, I had just demonstrated pretty conclusively that I could handle myself in a physical confrontation. But what I was proposing was bigger than just teaching one kid how to throw a punch. "I want to start a boxing club," I continued, the idea crystallizing in my mind even as I spoke it out loud. Not just to teach people how to fight, but to teach them confidence, discipline, self-respect, to show them that they do not have to be victims just because someone else has more money or a more famous last name. Marcus's eyes lit up like I had just offered him $1 million and a personal guarantee that bullies would never bother him again. "You really think that would work? You think the administration would allow it?" After what happened Friday night, I think the administration is going to be very interested in anything that reduces the likelihood of more public displays of student-on-student violence. I replied with a grin that probably looked more predatory than reassuring. That afternoon, I put up flyers around campus with a simple message. Westmont Boxing Club, learn to fight back. First meeting tonight in the auxiliary gymnasium. All students welcome. I expected maybe 5 or 6 kids to show up. Marcus, maybe a couple of other scholarship students who had been inspired by Friday night's demonstration. Perhaps 1 or 2 international kids who were tired of being pushed around. 23 students walked into that gymnasium. The diversity of the group was remarkable in a way that would have been impossible just a week earlier. There were scholarship kids like Marcus, obviously, but also some of the regular students who had grown tired of watching bullies run the school unchallenged. There were international students who had been dealing with their own forms of discrimination, kids from middle-class families who did not quite fit into either the privilege or the charity categories, and even a few who came from money but had been disgusted by the behavior of their wealthier classmates. And then, to the absolute shock of everyone in that room, Preston Huntington III walked through the door. The silence that followed his entrance was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop on the polished gymnasium floor. Marcus looked like he was ready to run, several other students took unconscious steps backward, and everyone turned to look at me to see how I would handle this unexpected development. "What are you doing here, Preston?" I asked, my voice calm but carrying enough steel to let everyone know that the wrong answer would result in a very short membership in our little club. Preston looked around the room at all those faces, kids he had bullied, ignored, or terrorized over the years. And I could see him struggling with what was probably the first genuine moment of humility in his entire 18 years of existence. "I am here to learn," he said simply, his voice stripped of the arrogance that had always defined him. "I am here because I realize that I do not know the first thing about real strength, real courage, or real character. And I am here because I want to earn the right to be in the same room as people who have those qualities." Chapter 8. Teaching More Than Boxing. Over the next few months, that boxing club became something special. We met every day after school, and I taught those kids everything Coach Williams had taught me, not just about throwing punches, but about discipline, respect, and standing up for what's right. Marcus turned out to be a natural. He was small, but he was quick and smart, and more importantly, he had heart. Watching him gain confidence week by week was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. Preston surprised everyone, including himself. That boy worked harder than anyone in the gym, taking every punch, every knockdown, every humbling moment as a lesson. It took months, but slowly, he started to change. One day, after a particularly tough sparring session, he stayed behind to help me clean up the gym. "Zara," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Why did you let me join? After everything I did, why give me a chance?" I thought about that for a moment, coiling up the jump ropes. "Because," I said finally, "I believe people can change. But more than that, I believe they have to choose to change. And that day you walked into this gym, you made a choice." Preston nodded slowly. I had a lot of time to think after our fight, about the way I was raised, the things I was taught to believe about people who look different from me, who come from different places. "And what did you figure out?" "That I was wrong, about a lot of things. And that being wrong doesn't make you worthless, it just makes you human. But staying wrong when you know better? That's what makes you worthless." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I'd never expected to see: genuine remorse and a real desire to be better. "You know what, Preston?" I said. "You might just make it after all." Chapter 9. The Bigger Fight. But our success in the gym was attracting the wrong kind of attention. Some of the parents, particularly those whose children had been on the wrong side of our newfound confidence, started complaining to the administration. They couldn't say directly what they were really upset about, that their children were no longer allowed to bully scholarship kids and minorities without consequences. So instead, they focused on the boxing club itself. "It's too violent," they claimed, "inappropriate for an academic institution of Westman's caliber." The pressure mounted until finally Headmaster Blackwood called me into his office. "Miss Johnson, he said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. We need to discuss your extracurricular activities. I sat down across from him, keeping my back straight and my voice level. What about them, sir? There have been complaints. Parents are concerned about the message we're sending by allowing students to engage in physical confrontations. You mean learning self-defense? I mean encouraging conflict as a solution to problems. I felt that familiar anger rising in my chest, but I kept it controlled. Respectfully, sir, I disagree. We're teaching discipline, confidence, and yes, self-defense. But more importantly, we're teaching kids not to be victims. Headmaster Blackwood finally looked up at me. Miss Johnson, I'm going to be frank with you. Your scholarship is contingent on maintaining certain standards, not just academic, but behavioral. Some people feel that your recent activities fall outside those standards. The threat was clear. Shut down the boxing club or lose my scholarship. I see him, I said. And these some people, would they happen to be the same parents whose children were used to having free rein to terrorize other students? His face tightened. That's quite an accusation. It's quite a situation, I replied. Sir, with respect, I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. I've seen kids like Marcus get their heads shoved in toilets just for existing. I've seen scholarship students drop out because they couldn't take the harassment anymore. I leaned forward, looking him directly in the eye. You want to know what message we're sending? We're sending the message that every student at this school, regardless of their bank account or their background, deserves to be treated with dignity. If that's controversial, then maybe the problem isn't with us. Headmaster Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. The boxing club will be reviewed by the board next month, he said finally. I suggest you prepare a very compelling case for why it should continue. You know what nobody warns you about when you are busy changing the world? Sometimes the most unexpected complications come not from your enemies, but from the people who surprise you by becoming something else entirely. And Preston Huntington III was about to become the most confusing chapter in my already complicated story. It started with the way he looked at me after training sessions, when the sweat was still dripping from his perfectly styled hair, and his expensive workout gear was soaked through like he had actually earned his exhaustion. There was something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Not the entitled arrogance that had defined him for 18 years, but something vulnerable and real that made my stomach do things I was not ready to acknowledge. The first time I noticed it, we had just finished a particularly brutal sparring session where Marcus had dropped Preston with a clean body shot. Instead of getting angry or making excuses like the old Preston would have done, he had gotten back up with a smile that was equal parts pain and something that looked suspiciously like admiration. You taught him that combination, did not you? He asked me afterward, dabbing at a cut on his lip with a towel that probably cost more than my entire workout wardrobe. I teach everyone everything I know, I replied, trying to ignore the way his voice had gotten softer when he talked to me, like he was sharing secrets instead of making conversation. Even me? He asked. And there was something in the way he said it that made my heart skip beats I did not want it to skip. That was when I started noticing things I should not have been noticing, like how his transformation had changed more than just his character. The arrogant pretty boy had evolved into someone with actual substance, and the combination of his physical attractiveness with his newfound humility was creating problems I was not equipped to handle. Preston started staying late after training sessions, always finding excuses to help me clean up equipment or organize the gym for the next day. He would ask questions about my life in Detroit, about my family, about my dreams beyond Westman Academy. And the most dangerous part was that his interest seemed genuine, like he actually cared about my answers instead of just looking for ammunition to use against me. You know what I keep thinking about? He said one evening as we were putting away gloves and wrapping up jump ropes. The gym was empty except for us, and the silence felt charged with electricity I did not want to acknowledge. What? I asked, though part of me was afraid of what he might say. 6 months ago, I saw you as someone beneath my notice. Less than human if I am being honest about how terrible I was, he said, his voice carrying a self-awareness that the old Preston never could have achieved. Now I look at you and see someone who is everything I want to become. Strong, principled, fearless, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with money or privilege? The word beautiful hit me like a punch to the solar plexus, unexpected and powerful enough to knock the breath out of my lungs. This was Preston Huntington III, heir to a banking fortune, golden boy of Connecticut society, telling a scholarship girl from Detroit that she was beautiful. And the most confusing part was that I could see he meant it. This was not some calculated attempt to manipulate me or gain advantage in our ongoing transformation of Westman Academy. This was genuine attraction from someone who had learned to see past the superficial categories that had defined his worldview for 18 years. Preston, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the chaos erupting in my chest. We cannot go down this road. You know that, right? Everything we have built here, everything we are trying to accomplish, personal complications could destroy all of it. But even as I said the words, I could feel my resolve weakening under the intensity of his gaze. There was something intoxicating about being seen as desirable by someone who had once considered me worthless. Something validating about watching prejudice transform into attraction. I know, he said, stepping closer in a way that made my heart rate spike like I was preparing for a fight. I know it is complicated and dangerous and probably stupid, but I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. The sparring sessions became exercises in torture after that conversation. Every time Preston and I worked together, there was an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with boxing technique and everything to do with the way his hands felt when he helped me adjust my stance, the way our eyes met when we were clinched together, the way my body responded to his proximity, despite every rational thought telling me to maintain professional distance. He was a quick learner. I had to give him that. The entitled rich boy who had relied on size and aggression was evolving into someone who understood strategy, timing, and the sweet science of using an opponent's strength against them. But what was really driving me crazy was how much I enjoyed teaching him, how proud I felt when he executed a combination correctly, how my heart raced when he looked to me for approval after a good round. You are getting better, I told him after a session where he had successfully defended himself against two larger opponents using technique rather than brute force. Good teacher, he replied, and the way he said it made clear he was talking about more than just boxing lessons. The first time he asked me out, I turned him down so fast it probably gave him whiplash. We were walking out of the gym together, both of us exhausted and sweaty and glowing with the endorphin rush that comes from pushing your body to its limits. Zara, he said, catching my arm gently as we reached the parking lot, would you maybe want to get dinner sometime? Not at the dining hall, I mean really go out. There is this place in Hartford that serves the best Caribbean food outside of the islands themselves. The offer was tempting for about a dozen reasons I did not want to examine too closely. But the rational part of my brain, the part that sounded like my mama warning me about getting distracted from my goals, shut it down immediately. Preston, we cannot, I said, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. You know we cannot. What we are doing here is too important to risk on personal complications. He nodded like he understood, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes, and that disappointment did things to my resolve that I was not prepared for. The breaking point came 3 weeks later during a particularly intense sparring session where Preston and I were working on close quarters fighting. We were practicing techniques for when opponents get inside your reach, how to create space and counterattack when someone has invaded your personal bubble. The drill required us to be pressed close together, our bodies touching as we moved through the combinations. His chest against my back as I showed him how to break a rear clinch. His hands on my waist as he learned to control distance. His breath on my neck as we worked through the mechanics of close-range striking. By the time we finished, the air between us was electric with tension that had nothing to do with boxing and everything to do with the attraction we had both been trying to ignore. We were standing in the center of the empty gym, both of us breathing hard, both of us looking at each other like we were on the edge of a cliff and considering whether to jump. Zara, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper, more dangerous. Preston, do not, I warned. But my voice lacked conviction because every cell in my body was screaming for me to close the distance between us. He stepped closer, and I should have stepped back. I should have maintained professional boundaries and kept our relationship focused on the boxing club and the social transformation we were creating together. But instead, I found myself frozen in place, caught between what I knew was smart and what I desperately wanted. I cannot stop thinking about you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know it is crazy and complicated and probably the worst timing in the history of bad timing, but I cannot pretend anymore that this is just about boxing lessons and social justice. And then, before I could protest or step away or do any of the smart things that responsible people do when they find themselves in impossible situations, he kissed me. It was not the kind of kiss you see in movies, soft and romantic and perfectly choreographed. It was desperate and hungry and full of months of suppressed tension finally finding an outlet. His hands tangled in my hair, my arms wrapped around his neck, and for about 30 seconds the entire world disappeared except for the taste of his lips and the feeling of his body pressed against mine. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing like we had just gone 10 rounds with heavyweight champions, the reality of what had just happened crashed over me like ice water. "Oh God," I said, stepping back and trying to ignore the way my lips were still tingling from the contact. "Preston, we cannot do this. This is exactly what I was afraid of." "Why?" he asked, his voice carrying a frustration that matched my own. "Why can we not explore this? Why does everything have to be about politics and social justice and maintaining proper boundaries?" "Because," I said, my voice rising with the intensity of emotions I had been trying to suppress for weeks, "because I am a black girl from Detroit on a scholarship, and you are Preston Huntington III, heir to a banking fortune. Because your parents are already trying to destroy everything I have built here, and if they find out their son is romantically involved with the scholarship girl who is corrupting their precious institution, they will come after me with everything they have. So we keep it private," he said, stepping closer again despite my protests. "So we figure out how to make this work without jeopardizing what we have built together." For a moment, I let myself imagine what that might look like. Secret meetings after training sessions, stolen kisses in empty classrooms, text messages that we would have to delete immediately, the thrill of forbidden romance combined with the danger of discovery. But then reality reasserted itself, cold and unforgiving as a Detroit winter. "Preston, you do not understand," I said, forcing myself to step back, even though every instinct was telling me to move closer. "This is not about us. This is about every student at Westmont Academy who has ever been made to feel worthless because of where they come from or what they look like. If I get distracted by personal complications, if I lose focus on what really matters, then all of this has been for nothing." He looked like I had just punched him in the stomach, and part of me wanted to take back the words even as I was saying them. But the rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive and focused through 3 years of preparation for this opportunity, knew that I was right. "I understand," he said finally, though his voice suggested he understood exactly nothing about the impossible position I was in. "I understand that the cause is more important than personal happiness. I just wish—" "What?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I just wish the world was different. I wish we had met under different circumstances, when there was not so much at stake, when we could just be two people who cared about each other instead of symbols of everything that is wrong with American society." The longing in his voice nearly broke my resolve completely, because the truth was, I wished for the same thing. I wished I could be just a 17-year-old girl with a crush on a boy who had surprised her by becoming someone worth caring about. I wished personal happiness was a luxury I could afford to pursue, but wishing did not change reality, and reality was that I had responsibilities that went far beyond my own desires. "Maybe someday," I said, the words feeling like a promise I was not sure I could keep. "Maybe when all of this is over, when we have graduated and moved on to our separate lives, maybe then we can figure out what this is between us." "Maybe," he agreed, but we both knew that maybe was just another word for probably never. The weeks that followed were exercises in exquisite torture. We maintained professional boundaries during training sessions, but the tension between us was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every accidental touch during sparring drills sent electricity shooting through my system. Every moment when our eyes met across the gym made my heart race like I was preparing for the fight of my life. Preston threw himself into training with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Like physical exhaustion was the only thing that could quiet the emotions we had both acknowledged and then forced ourselves to ignore. He got better faster than anyone had a right to, developing skills that would have taken most people months to master. And I pretended not to notice how proud I felt when he succeeded, how worried I got when he took hard shots during sparring, how much I looked forward to the moments when we worked together on technique. The breaking point came 2 weeks before the board meeting that would determine our fate. When Preston approached me after a particularly brutal training session with an offer that I should have refused immediately. "My parents are going out of town this weekend," he said, his voice carefully casual in a way that made every nerve in my body stand at attention. "Board meeting preparation in New York. They will be gone from Friday night until Sunday evening." He paused, and I could see him working up the courage to say what came next. "I was thinking maybe you could come over. We could watch movies, order takeout, just spend time together without worrying about who might see us or what people might think." The offer hung in the air between us like forbidden fruit, tempting and dangerous and absolutely irresistible, despite every rational argument against it. "Preston," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction that should have accompanied such a sensible refusal. "Just as friends," he added quickly, though we both knew that was a lie. "Just two people who care about each other, spending time together without all the complications of school politics and social hierarchies." I should have said no. I should have maintained the boundaries we had established and focused on the upcoming board meeting that would determine whether everything we had built together would survive. I should have been smart and responsible and mature. Instead, I heard myself saying, "What time?" The smile that spread across his face was worth every rational argument against what we were about to do. "7 o'clock Friday night," he said. "I will text you the address." And that was how I found myself standing outside the most expensive house I had ever seen on Friday evening, my heart pounding like I was about to step into the ring with a heavyweight champion, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything between us forever. What happened behind those doors would either destroy everything we had built together or transform it into something even more powerful and dangerous. But first, there was a board meeting to survive, and the fate of every student at Westmont Academy hung in the balance. Chapter 10. The Board Meeting. The board meeting was held on a Thursday evening in Westmont's marble-columned conference room. As I walked in, I saw exactly what I'd expected. A room full of wealthy faces, most of them belonging to parents who'd been trying to get rid of me since day one. But I wasn't alone. Marcus was there, along with Preston and a dozen other students from the boxing club. Coach Williams had driven up from Detroit to support me. Even some of the teachers who'd seen the positive changes in their students were present. Mrs. Huntington, Preston's mother, was serving as board chair. She looked at me with the kind of cold politeness that rich people perfect. "Miss Johnson," she said, "you've requested time to address the board regarding your boxing club. You have 10 minutes. I stood up, feeling the weight of every gaze in that room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "6 months ago, I came to Westmont Academy as a scholarship student from Detroit. I came here to get an education, to better myself, and to stay out of trouble." I paused, looking around the room. But sometimes trouble finds you, and sometimes staying silent in the face of injustice is the biggest trouble of all. I told them about Marcus and the bathroom incident. I told them about the systematic harassment that scholarship students and minorities faced at their precious academy. I told them about the culture of entitlement and cruelty that their children had been allowed to perpetuate. "The boxing club," I said, "isn't about teaching conflict. It's about teaching strength. Not just physical strength, but the strength to stand up for yourself and others. The strength to do what's right even when it's hard." Some of the board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. In the 6 months since we started the club, disciplinary incidents have dropped by 60%. Academic performance among participating students has improved. Most importantly, students who used to walk these halls in fear now walk with confidence. I looked directly at Mrs. Huntington. "Your son was one of our first members. Preston, would you like to tell the board about your experience?" Preston stood up, and I could see his hands shaking slightly. This was harder for him than any boxing match, standing up to his own parents and their expectations. "6 months ago," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, I was someone I'm not proud of. I used my family's position and my own privilege to hurt other people. I thought that made me strong. He looked around the room at his parents' friends, people who'd known him since he was a baby. Zara taught me that real strength isn't about making other people feel small. It's about lifting them up. The boxing club didn't make me aggressive. It taught me discipline, respect, and what it really means to be a man. The silence in that room was deafening. But then Marcus stood up. "If I may," he said, his young voice clear and strong. "Before the boxing club, I was thinking about transferring schools. The harassment had gotten so bad that I couldn't concentrate on my studies. Now I'm ranked third in my class, and I walk through these halls with my head held high." One by one, other students stood up to share their stories. Stories of transformation, of growth, of learning to stand up for themselves and others. When they were finished, I stood again. "You have a choice to make tonight," I said. "You can shut down a program that's actually making your school a better place because it makes some people uncomfortable. Or you can choose to support something that's teaching your students the values you claim to believe in: respect, integrity, and strength of character." I paused, letting that sink in. The choice is yours. But understand this: if you choose to silence us, you're not just shutting down a boxing club. You're sending a message to every student in this school about what really matters to you. And that message will echo through these halls long after I'm gone. Chapter 11. The verdict and beyond. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they came back, Mrs. Huntington's face was unreadable. "After careful consideration," she said, "the board has decided that the boxing club may continue, with the condition that it operates under the supervision of the athletics department and follows all school guidelines for student organizations." The relief in that room was palpable. Marcus grinned so wide I thought his face might split. Preston looked like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. But Mrs. Huntington wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "we want to make it clear that any future incidents involving club members will result in immediate termination of the program." I nodded. "Understood. Thank you for your time and consideration." As we filed out of the room, Preston caught up with me in the hallway. "Zara," he said, "thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet," I replied. "This is just the beginning. Real change takes time, and it takes all of us working together." What I could not have predicted was how Preston and I would become the heart of that transformation, both as leaders and as something more personal that neither of us had expected. After the board meeting, with the immediate threat to our program behind us, we finally allowed ourselves to explore what had been building between us for months. That Friday night at his family's estate turned into the beginning of something beautiful and complicated and absolutely worth fighting for. We spent hours talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories about our childhoods that could not have been more different, discovering that underneath all the privilege and prejudice, we were just two 17-year-olds trying to figure out who we wanted to become. The romance that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not the dramatic, all-consuming passion you see in movies, but something steady and supportive that made both of us stronger. Preston became my closest confidant, the person who understood the pressure I carried as the face of change at Westman Academy. I became his anchor, the person who helped him navigate his family's disappointment and his own journey toward becoming someone worth respecting. We kept our relationship quiet at first, not because we were ashamed, but because we wanted to protect what we were building together. Late-night study sessions in empty classrooms, stolen moments after boxing club meetings, text messages that made me smile during the most stressful moments of senior year. It was young love in its purest form, two people supporting each other's dreams while learning what it meant to put someone else's happiness alongside your own. Over the next 2 years, Westman Academy slowly but surely became a different place. The boxing club grew to over 50 members. Incidents of bullying became rare, and when they did happen, other students stepped in to stop them. I graduated as valedictorian and student body president. My acceptance letter to Harvard came with a full scholarship and a personal note from the admissions dean, praising my exceptional leadership and commitment to social justice. But the moment I'm most proud of happened 3 months before graduation. I was walking through the halls when I saw a group of upperclassmen surrounding a nervous-looking freshman, a skinny kid with thick glasses who clearly didn't fit their idea of what a Westmont student should look like. Before I could intervene, Marcus stepped into the circle. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The upperclassmen looked at him, this kid they remembered as the scared freshman who used to get stuffed in lockers, and saw someone completely different, someone who wouldn't back down. "No problem," one of them mumbled, and they walked away. Marcus helped the freshman gather his scattered books. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," the kid said, still shaky. "Thanks." "No worries," Marcus replied. "That's what we do here. We look out for each other." As I watched Marcus walk away with the freshman, showing him around and making him feel welcome, I felt a pride that had nothing to do with boxing victories or academic achievements. This was the real victory, a generation of students who understood that strength meant protecting the vulnerable, not preying on them. Epilogue. Legacy. I'm 25 now, working as a civil rights attorney and running a nonprofit organization that teaches self-defense and leadership skills to underprivileged youth. But I still go back to Westmont Academy once a year to speak to the new students. The boxing club is still going strong, now officially called the Zara Johnson Leadership Center. Marcus is a sophomore at Yale, studying political science and planning to run for office someday. Preston graduated from Princeton and now works for a foundation that provides scholarships to minority students. Preston and I are no longer together. We grew up, went to different colleges, and discovered we were meant for different paths. But I will always be grateful for what we shared at Westmont Academy. He taught me that people can genuinely change and that love could bridge any divide when built on mutual respect. Now I am dating Jamal Washington, a civil rights lawyer from Atlanta who shares my passion for justice and understands my mission. He is brilliant, compassionate, and fights for people who cannot fight for themselves. And yes, I hope someday he will become my husband. Last year, when I gave my annual speech, a young girl in the front row raised her hand. "Miss Johnson," she said, "what would you tell someone who's scared to stand up for themselves?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw myself at that age, scared, uncertain, but with a fire burning inside that was just waiting for someone to help her fan it into a flame. "I'd tell her," I said, "that courage isn't about not being scared. Courage is about being scared and doing what's right anyway. And I'd tell her that she's stronger than she knows, braver than she believes, and more important than she thinks." The girl smiled, and I saw something shift in her eyes. That same recognition I'd seen in the mirror the day I decided to stop being invisible. After my speech, as I was walking through the halls of Westmont Academy, I stopped at the spot where Preston had grabbed my skirt all those years ago. The hallway looked the same, but everything had changed. On the wall was a plaque that read, "In honor of all students who choose courage over comfort, strength over silence, and justice over apathy." Below it was a quote that the student body had chosen. "Real strength isn't about making others feel small, it's about lifting them up." Zara Johnson, class of 2015. I stood there for a moment, thinking about that scared girl from Detroit who'd walked through these gates 7 years ago, trying to make herself invisible. She never could have imagined that one day her story would inspire others to find their own strength. But that's the thing about courage. It's contagious. When one person decides to stand up, others find the strength to stand with them. And together we can change the world. One fight at a time. The fight continues. It always has and it always will. But now I know something I didn't know at 17. We're not fighting alone. And that makes all the difference.